And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome. I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Update on this Tuesday, July 16th, 2024. We start out with the sea ice. On this Tuesday afternoon, a lot of open water now finally along the Chukchi Sea coastline. We still have some areas of ice further north in the Arctic Ocean and certainly along the central eastern Arctic coastline from Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, though there is some melt-off in the mid to late summer. Melt-off will just continue along this area of the Arctic. Temperature-wise, we are going to start to see some warmer temperatures returning to the central and east central mainland as we go through this weekend, so that should help bump temperatures up a little bit along the Arctic coast as well. But looking at what we have in store for the next weather system of note, it's this low pressure with an atmospheric river. That's a deeper moisture-laden surge of air that's coming up out of the Pacific into the Panhandle. Later tonight and Wednesday, it's going to bring another round of moderate to heavy rainfall across a good portion of the Panhandle, focused in the area around Juneau. Could pick up another 2 to 4 inches of rain late tonight through late Wednesday night. And then another little system will come up in the wake of that, not as potent, but still keeping some areas of rain and rain showers going across the Panhandle here for the end of the week. Weak area of low pressure out here, south central Kenai Peninsula area. This low south of the eastern Aleutians will stay south of the Alaska Peninsula. And then for Wednesday afternoon, already that moisture surge is coming up along this trough. Pretty mild air mass too, with freezing levels above 10,000 feet. So by Thursday afternoon, here comes the next little low. That'll just reinforce some rainfall across the Panhandle for the latter half of Thursday into Friday. And then the bigger change, this is a surface reflection, but across the mainland, we're going to see a ridge of high pressure in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere develop over this weekend, which is going to allow for things to dry out across much of the mainland and provide warmer temperatures through the course of the weekend into early next week. So for the Panhandle, with this next system coming in, it's another wet one. At least small craft advisories, maybe a few gale force, low-end gale force gusts. But on Wednesday, southeast to south winds 25 knots across the inner channels, waves 4 or 5 feet with periods of moderate to heavy rain. Along the outer coast, winds southeast 25 knots off of Craig there, waves 9 feet, but more of a westerly wind as you go up the coastline, Sitka up to all the way up there to Cape Suckling, with generally westerly winds to 20 knots. And then on Thursday, variable winds around 5 knots there in Lynn Canal, waves a foot or two, north winds 10 knots, Stevens Passage down through Dixon Entrance with waves running a couple of feet. Sitka southward, look for north winds at 15 knots, swells 5-6 feet, and then west-northwest winds 10 to 15 knots outside of Gustavus and Yakutat. And then for the northwestern Gulf, west winds 15 knots within Prince William Sound, waves 2 to 3 feet there. Generally southwest winds off the Kenai coast at 15 knots. Variable winds around 10 knots at the entrance of Cook Inlet, but south to southwest winds as we go up through the middle upper Cook Inlet with waves 2 to 3 feet. And then for Thursday, kind of a mixed bag of winds. Variable winds outside of Hinchinbrook Entrance and off the Kenai coastline and northeast of Kodiak Island, just at 10 knots, waves 2 to 3 feet. Within Prince William Sound, southeast winds 15 knots, waves maybe a couple of feet at best. Northwest winds 10 knots, 1-2 foot waves upper Cook Inlet, but south winds on the order of 15 knots from the entrance of Cook Inlet on up off of Anchor Point with waves there 3 feet. Look for southwest winds around 15 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island on Wednesday, waves just a few feet there, and then generally variable winds around 10 knots across much of the Alaska Peninsula with waves not much more than a couple of feet. And then for Thursday, variable winds around 10 knots in the vicinity of Kodiak Island, but generally west-northwest winds around 15 knots across the Alaska Peninsula. And through the eastern and central Aleutians on Wednesday, winds will generally be out of the northwest, 15 to 20 knots, turning back more toward the south once you get west of Adak at 15 knots. And then on Thursday, we have winds variable to 15 knots around Dutch Harbor, but turning back around to the southeast and then increasing. Look for southeast to south winds increasing to 25 knots from Atka back through and west of Adak, and then turning more toward the east out there west of Kiska toward Shimei at 25 knots. Along the southwest coast, variable winds around 10 knots within Bristol Bay, north winds 10 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay, north winds 15 knots there in the vicinity of the Pribilovs. For the lower Yukon Delta, 10 to 15 knot northwest winds, a westerly 15 knot wind within into Norton Sound. And then on Thursday, winds will be generally northwesterly, 15 knots there around Kuskokwim and Bristol Bays. Variable winds 10 knots in the vicinity of St. Paul. And westerly winds into Norton Sound along the lower Yukon coastline at 15 to 20 knots. For the area up through the Bering Strait, we're looking at south winds 15 to 20 knots, waves 3 to 4 feet. Winds may accelerate a bit south-southwest 25 to 20 knots there around Point Hope, Cape Lisburn to Point Ley, and continue southwesterly there at least west of Utqiagvik at 10 knots, but then flipping around to the east at 15 knots, Prudhoe Bay on over to Kaktovik. And still easterly winds only around 5 knots in the vicinity of Kaktovik on Thursday, but southwest winds 15 knots from Prudhoe Bay down through Utqiagvik and Wainwright. And then as we drop on down through the lower Chukchi, winds generally from the south around 20 knots, though through the Bering Strait, expect southwest winds at 20 to 25 knots and then more of a westerly wind to 25 knots there in the vicinity of Gamble, and waves generally through the lower Chukchi Sea and in that corner of the far northern Bering, look for waves of about 4 to 5 feet.